Before you move on to reading chapters 4 and 5, which is your next reading assignment, I want to talk about the beginning of chapter 2, because I really think that this describes how Nick and through Nick Fitzgerald sees the American dream. So this is a part where they are driving through this place called the Valley of Ashes. So on the edge of the island, you've got West Egg and East Egg. This is where rich people live. And yeah, more fashionable and less fashionable rich people, but all ridiculously rich. To get into New York City from those places, you have to drive through what Nick calls the Valley of Ashes. This is an actual real place in the 1920s. It was basically where they burned garbage. So this just like heaps of garbage that are burned down to ash is all just like settling into this one place. So let's read what he says here. This is on page 23. I want you to pause the video, get out your books and open with me so that you can see how we're close reading this. So he says, about halfway between West Egg and New York, the motor road hastily joins the railroad and runs beside it for a quarter of a mile so as to shrink away from a certain desolate area of land. That word desolate is very important here. Desolate, I have it up here in the dictionary, says a deserted of people and in a state of bleak and dismal emptiness, or a place to make a place bleakly and depressingly empty or bare. So it contains with it this like bleakness, or which obviously goes with this idea of ashes, just like gray covering everything. It's a depressing kind of place. But I think also what's really important there is the loneliness, like the emptiness or the barrenness. It's made more depressing because it seems so empty of life. He says, this is the Valley of Ashes, a fantastic farm where ashes grow like wheat into ridges and hills and grotesque gardens. Right there, I think he might be comparing that to his home, in the Midwest, where, known as the breadbasket of America. It's where all of the crops are very fertile and green and feed America. And here it's just like all of the waste potentially from those products. So it says, where ashes take the form of houses and chimneys and rising smoke, and finally, with a transcendent effort of men who move dimly and already crumbling through the powdery air. And this is where we get the image of the people who actually live in the Valley of Ashes. It may seem desolate, but it is not actually desolate. These people have to live here. And I think that word transcendent is so important there. This, you've looked up the word transcendent before. Transcendent means to rise above something, right? Beyond or above the range of normal or merely physical human experience, which means for them to move around takes transcendent effort. They've been so beaten down that they have to rise above normal human behavior to be able to move. And they move dimly and already crumbling through the powdery air. And these are the people themselves that are moving dimly and already crumbling. So they're lacking a kind of vibrancy and they're barely hanging on. Occasionally, a line of gray cars crawls along an invisible track, gives out a ghastly creak, and comes to rest. And immediately, the ash gray men swarm up with leaden spades and stir up an impenetrable cloud which screens their obscure operations from your sight. That phrase, the ash gray men swarm up, when do we usually use that word swarm? We usually don't describe people with the word swarm. We usually describe animals, like bugs specifically. Bugs swarm, flying, attacking wasps swarm, and yet here are people being described that way. And when they swarm to work on your car, they kick up all this cloud. He calls it an impenetrable cloud. So you can't see through it. You can't penetrate that cloud to see what they are actually doing. And it obscures their operations from your sight. Or it screens their obscure operations from your sight. So what happens here is they come running up to the cars. They're working on them, kicking up all this dust, and you can't see them anymore. And because they were so dim, because they were swarming, and because they were already crumbling, they're not really people that you want to look at. When their labor is obscured from you, it's kind of a relief because you don't have to worry about what they're doing anymore. And above the scene, it says, but above the gray land and the spasms of bleak dust which drift endlessly over it, you perceive after a moment the eyes of Dr. T.J. Eckelberg. The eyes of Dr. T.J. Eckelberg are blue and gigantic. Their retinas are 1 yard high. He is talking about a billboard right here. It's an old advertisement that is basically the only spot of color in this setting. They look out of no face, but instead from a pair of enormous yellow spectacles, which pass over a non-existent nose. Evidently, some wild rag of an oculist set them there to fatten his practice in the borough of Queens, and then sat down himself into eternal blindness, or forgot them and moved away. But his eyes, dimmed a little by many paintless days under sun and rain, brood on over the solemn dumping ground. So here you have the working men covered in ashes, trying to, trying to make a living in this place that is completely barren. And above it all, you see this billboard that looks like it is just always gazing down on them, always judging them. You think about what a billboard is about, and particularly like this billboard it's an advertisement for an oculist. It's an advertisement for glasses, I believe. Now I'm getting a little sidetracked here, but it's this advertisement, and it is looking over them at all times so that they can always look up, they can always see what is for sale, and looking at their circumstances, what they can't afford, and what is kind of like determining their actions. So yes, those are two really important symbols in this book, the Valley of Ashes and Dr. T.J. Eckleburg billboard. In this little section of the book too, we also meet Mr. Wilson and his wife, who is having the affair with Tom Buchanan. But let's focus on Mr. Wilson for a second. He is the only person in this book that we actually see. I shouldn't say that, there are a couple, but this is really the main person that we see actually working. We see him in his place of business. He is he repairs cars, and we actually see him at work, talking to Tom about his work. And what's interesting to me is the way that Nick describes him. He is not a very appealing kind of character. His eyes are like he is a ghost. He's one of these ash men who swarm. And I think we need to think about this idea of hard work in the American dream when we look at this section. The people that seem to represent like the most successful, classy people in the book, even though Nick hates Tom and Daisy represent this ideal goal that everybody else in the book seems to want. They want to be where Tom and Daisy are. And yet Tom and Daisy, we have discussed, their sort of mobility in their chapter and how they can just sort of flit around from place to place. They don't have to work for a living. Tom comes from generational wealth. And here, the person who has to work for a living, George Wilson, is written about in the most unappealing way possible. And then look at how it describes his wife. This is on page 25. He says, his voice faded off and Tom glanced impatiently around the garage. Then I heard footsteps on a stair, and in a moment, the thickish figure of a woman blocked out the light from the office door. It uses that word thick, but it does not mean thick in the 2022 version of the word thick. It is talking about her just being like stout. But also, actually, you know what? Maybe it is kind of in the 2022 version of the word, because he talks about her being sort of like voluptuous. He says she was in her middle 30s and faintly stout, but she carried her surplus flesh sensuously, as some women can. So he's talking about her being curvy. So yeah, I guess it is the same kind of thick. Her face, above a spotted dress of dark blue crepe de chine, contained no facet or gleam of beauty. She's ugly, but there was an immediately perceptible vitality about her, as if the nerves of her body were continually smoldering. So basically, he's talking about her like she is sort of unsophisticated but sexual at the same time. Really unappealing way to describe her. And this is, again, part of the working class. So to wrap up this video, I just want you to think, going into chapters 4 and 5, what does this book believe about the value of hard work? Because the American dream we've talked about, part of the American dream seems to include this concept of you work really hard, you take your opportunities and you take advantage of them, and this is how you achieve this thing called the American dream. But do we really, as a nation, value the working class? It's just something I want you to think about as we move forward.